Hey everyone, I wanted to give us a little bit of an overview of World War I and the U.S. economy before we move on to the 1920s. Don't really want to get into too much detail on this, but I do want us to have some familiarity with the war and how it influenced the U.S. economy. It is obviously a pretty large war. World War is in the title. And it's really the first major war the United States got involved in since the Civil War. Yes, there had been Indian wars in the 1860s and the 1870s. There's the Spanish-American War in the 1890s. But those wars didn't require near the effort that this war did. And those were not wars which really saw the U.S. economy gear up and mobilize for war. Now, before talking specifically about the war and the U.S. economy, I do want us to give us some sense of how the war begins, just so that way we can understand what war it is that the United States is getting into and why the United States might get into that war. The triggering event, if you will, is the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand was the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Archduke meant that he was the heir to the throne. Austro-Hungary was a major empire in Central Europe. It included the modern-day nations of Austria and Hungary, as you might guess from the name. Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia. I'm sorry, not Serbia. Serbia had just recently broken away from them. But that whole region of Europe was controlled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He is assassinated in June of 1914 by a terrorist organization it was connected to the neighboring nation of Serbia. Serbia was a major rival of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, while the Serbian government did not sponsor or was not part of the assassination, the fact that it was a Serbian-associated terrorist organization, of course, made the Austro-Hungarians pretty angry at their neighbor, Serbia. And so ultimately what we are going to see is that over the course of the next month, the relationship between Austria-Hungary and Serbia will get incredibly tense. Austria-Hungary issues a list of demands to the Serbians, things that they want the Serbians to do to deal with the terrorist organization that had been involved in the assassination of the Archduke. Needless to say, it really looked as if Serbia and Austria-Hungary would be going to war in the very near future. Now, that in and of itself wouldn't seem on the surface to be something that would cause a major world war. But what really complicates the matter is the alliance system that was already in place in Europe. For decades, Europe had been home to a couple of major alliances that had been put together primarily as a means of keeping peace and stability in Europe. On the one hand, it seemed to work for decades. As a matter of fact, Europe hadn't really seen a major war since the 1870s. So it really seemed as if the alliance system was working. But in this particular case, the alliance system will, instead of limiting the outbreak of a war, will ultimately make what could have been a relatively minor war into a much larger ordeal, one that Europe would seemingly never recover from. Now, the alliances that were in place were these two, as you can see on the map, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. Here in June of 1914, upon the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary had a very strong alliance with Germany and was a little bit more loosely affiliated with Italy. As you can see, Austria-Hungary and Germany had as their enemies Russia, France, and Great Britain. Though maybe enemy is too strong a word to use as far as pre-World War I is concerned. Needless to say, Austria-Hungary's threatening tone towards Serbia which was not necessarily part of any major alliance, is not something that is appreciated by neighboring Russia. While Serbia was neutral and had no official alliance with Russia, Russia saw itself as the protector of the Slavic peoples of Europe. A lot of the people of Eastern Europe are of Slavic ethnic group. Russians are Slavs, Serbians are Slavs, Poles are Slavs, you can go on and on. Slavs really dominate Eastern Europe. So Russia feels like it has a duty to protect Serbia from neighboring Austria-Hungary. And so Russia makes pretty clear that if Austria-Hungary went after Serbia, that could very well bring Russia into the fray. Now here's the thing. Everybody knows that Austria-Hungary is not alone, that it has a very strong alliance with Germany. So if Russia declares war on Austria-Hungary because Austria-Hungary decides to declare war on Serbia, well, that is going to guarantee that Germany will declare war on Russia. But here's the thing. Russia, as you can see, has a very strong alliance with the French. Not because they really had anything in common, because they didn't. But what they did seem to have in common was a fear of Germany's growing might and power in the middle of Europe. So, what we are going to see is that if Austria and Germany end up going to war with the Russians, well, that is going to guarantee that the French will get into the war. And it gets even more complicated than that. As you can see, there is a connection between Great Britain and France and Russia. They are part of that Triple Entente, as it was called. In addition, what we are going to see is that Germany has a plan in place in case such an event arose to where they might find themselves going to war with the Russians and the French simultaneously. Germany had a plan that if this ever happened, they would invade France, not across the border, but they would invade France by going through tiny neutral Belgium. Here's the thing. Great Britain has vowed to protect neutral Belgium from any invading force. So what this means is that if Austria-Hungary decides that it is fed up with the Serbians, that it doesn't think the Serbians are taking this terrorist group seriously enough, it means that if they go to war with the Serbians, that is guaranteed to bring in the Russians and the Germans, which of course guaranteed to bring in the French. And since Germany will probably find itself at war with Russia and France at the same time, then Germany is going to try to invade France. Now I should clarify here, why try to invade France through Belgium? The Germans have this idea that it's going to take Russia quite a long time to really mobilize for war. That since Russia is so large, and since Russia's transportation network is not very well developed at the time, that Germany felt that it really had some time before it would have to worry about the Russians too much. France, however, is right there, much smaller, much more compact. So Germany had this idea that they could knock the French out relatively quickly and then focus on the Russians. Now, in order to really knock the French out very quickly, they believed that they could really surprise the French, if you will, by coming through Belgium instead of across the border. And it just seemed to be a more efficient invasion route, if you will. So either way you look at it, the connections that you have between these countries are going to ensure that if Austria-Hungary and the Serbians go to war, that it will end up being a much larger war. Now, of course, you might wonder in all of this, what about the Italians? It looks on this map like they're part of the Triple Alliance. Well, for reasons that we really don't need to get into, the Italians ultimately decide that they don't really want to be a part of the Triple Alliance. And so ultimately the Italians end up joining what before the war was known as the Triple Entente. So, to make a long story short, by the end of July, early August of 1914, most of these major nations of Europe find themselves at war with one another. The triggering moment being Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia, and that brings in those alliance systems. Now, throughout the duration of World War I, as we know it, or the Great War as they began to call it, throughout the duration of that war, the alliance systems change names. Germany and Austria-Hungary are known as the Central Powers, and they will later be joined by other nations, including what was then called the Ottoman Empire, or what we today know as Turkey. France, Russia, Great Britain, they will be known as the Allied Powers. Important to note that because that is the side that the United States will end up fighting on. So, in this horrible sequence of events, we find that most of Europe's major powers are suddenly at war with one another in the summer of 1914. And I think this cartoon puts it pretty well. You see little Serbia there in the front being confronted by the Austro-Hungarians behind them, who are confronted by the Russians, who are confronted by the Germans, who are confronted by the French, and then the British. So we just see that all of these major nations really are drawn into this war, not necessarily because they're all excited about it, but they really feel that they should honor the alliances that they were a part of, and they're duty bound, and next thing you know, they're at war with one another. Now, we don't really need to talk about how the war unfolds over the next several years. Needless to say, it does get fought all over much of Europe. There's fighting in Asia, there's fighting in Africa, there's fighting on the oceans. For our purposes, what we do need to be aware of is the fighting on what was called the Western Front at the time, or in France. Because what happens is this. Germany enacts this plan, as you can see on this little image here, of invading France by coming through Belgium. And the plan called for this amazing flanking move, if you will, in which they would encircle Paris, France's capital, thus surpassing all of the fortresses on the Franco-German border, and boom, within 2 months, bring France down. Now, that doesn't end up happening. As a matter of fact, the Germans will be stopped just outside of Paris by French and British forces. And what ends up happening is both sides, the French and British on one side, the Germans on the other, will end up digging vast networks of trenches. And thus we see trench warfare begin, that much of World War I is famous for. And that's the scene from late 1914 really until 1918. And it's a very bloody war, a war of attrition in which both sides really just try to bleed one another white. And as you could imagine, it's a horrible war that is unfolding out here in France. So when the United States enters the war, it will be to try to provide aid and assistance to France and to Great Britain, helping them, working with them, cooperating with them to push the Germans back out. So that's the scene in Europe. Now, when the war begins, the United States is very happy to be on the sidelines. There's nobody in the United States that really is thinking, hey, let's get into the war. You have a few people out there thinking that, but 99% of the American people are saying, we're glad we're over on this side of the Atlantic. But, of course, as we know, things don't really unfold that way. To understand why the United States gets pulled into the war, we need to talk a little bit about the British blockade of Germany. Early in the war, really in early 1915, just several months after the war begins, the British decide to use the most powerful weapon they have, and that is their navy. What they will do is establish a naval blockade of Germany, in which they will use their powerful navy as well as a number of mines placed in the sea to really keep, really try to cut Germany off economically from the rest of the world. Through this, the British believed that they could really strangle the German economy. Germany required a lot of food imports, they required a lot of industrial imports. Granted, Germany was a very powerful nation, it was a very industrialized and wealthy nation, but it still needed imports. And it's not a completely self-sustaining nation, because really, frankly, no country is a completely self-sustaining nation. And so the British are able to do this to great effect. And it really does wreak havoc on the German economy. And in the long run, on Germany's ability to wage an effective war. Understandably, this is very frustrating to Germany. Germany has a great and powerful navy of its own, but it's not quite enough to break through the British blockade. So Germany is desperate. Desperate enough to try something new. Something that they believe could enable them to establish a blockade of Great Britain. Great Britain, of course, is an island. If Germany could somehow establish a naval blockade of Great Britain, that could be even more disastrous than the British blockade of Germany. So how is Germany going to try to do this? They're going to try to do this through the use of the U-boat or submarine. And in February of 1915, Germany will declare what they called unrestricted submarine warfare, in which they declare that the waters around Great Britain are a war zone, and that ships that fly the flag of Great Britain or that fly the flag of British allies are liable to be sunk by German U-boats. So Germany declares that in February of 1915. They're going to try to target primarily British merchant ships, or again, merchant ships that belong to nations that are allied with Great Britain. So Germany embarked on this path of unrestricted submarine warfare, which will ultimately bring them into conflict with the United States. How does this happen? Well, first let's talk a little bit about something that doesn't bring the United States into the conflict, but definitely angers the American president, the American people in 1915. What we see is that in late January of 1917, the Germans decide that it is worth risking bringing the United States into the war to renew unrestricted submarine warfare on Great Britain. Their thought is that if they could really just unleash their U-boats on British shipping, they could really bring the British economy down, force Great Britain out of the war, before the United States could really have any impact. Not only does Germany do that in January of 1917, but a couple of months later, the Germans even begin sinking American shipping in the Atlantic, even though the United States wasn't a validly neutral nation. Well, in response to that, we are going to see that President Wilson will go to Congress in early April of 1917 and ask Congress to declare war on Germany. So, again, just 6 months after being re-elected on the strength of seemingly keeping the United States out of the war, President Wilson is asking Congress for a declaration of war on Germany. But again, important to remember that this is because of Germany's actions. They decided to renew unrestricted submarine warfare. They made the decision to begin targeting American shipping. American entry into the war really inevitable after that point. Now here's the thing. The United States is not really ready for war. So the United States is going to have to do quite a bit of work to really get prepared for war. And while we do enter the war in April of 1917, we're not really going to be able to have much impact on the war from a military perspective until March of 1918. Because we've got to prepare the military for war, we have to get the economy ready for war. There's a lot of pieces to the puzzle that have to be put in place before we can really jump in with both feet. Interestingly, the United States doesn't enter the war just to, say, punish Germany for unrestricted submarine warfare. As a matter of fact, President Wilson tries to make a very strong moral case for why we should enter the war. And he argued that it was for ideals that are much larger than just stopping Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare. Wilson was a very idealistic man. He's very much a progressive. We're in the middle of the progressive era. Very high-minded. So why does he say we should enter the war? He says we should enter the war to make this a great crusade that would make this the war to end all wars. Very idealistic right there. This idea that you could use American influence to make this the war to end all wars. He also argued that we should enter the war to make it of the world safe for democracy. Wilson's argument here was that democratic nations did not generally seek war with one another. Germany was very much not a democratic nation. It was ruled by a very powerful emperor. Same could be said for the Austria-Hungary, whereas Great Britain, France, the United States, they were all relatively democratic nations in the big scheme of things. And so Wilson argued that by entering the war, we could really promote democratic ideals, help really make countries democratic, and thus in making countries democratic, not only do we make the world safe for democracy, but since democracies seemingly didn't really wage wars on one another, we could make this the war to end all wars. Now again, Wilson understands that we're not really prepared for war, but he really believes that we have to do much more than just put uniforms on some individuals and say, hey, go fight the Germans over in France. Wilson goes on to say that it is not an army that we must shape and train for war. It is a nation. He really believes that this is a collective effort. Again, really reflecting his progressive background, his progressive ideals. Progressivism was all about collective action, collective intervention. And so he believed that that's how we needed to intervene in this war. So how to intervene in this war? Well, first, you have to be in shape to do so. You have to mobilize the nation, as President Wilson saw it. And so we're going to see a number of ways in which the Wilson administration, the federal government, will try to mobilize the American people for war. We are going to see a draft implemented for the first time since the American Civil War. While there will be many Americans that will enlist willingly, there are many others that will be drafted into the military. And keep in mind that at this time the United States military was relatively small, with the exception of the Navy. And let's face it, as great as the American Navy is, battleships aren't going to really have much impact on fighting, say, in French trenches, right? So we got to really build up that military. We got to be able to have an army that is large enough to go into France, work alongside the French and the British to drive the Germans out. We're also going to see major efforts at funding the war. This is going to be an expensive war. The spending is something like 30 times the typical federal budget of this era. It's going to cost a lot of money to build up the armed forces, to get the economy ready for war. So you got to get the money from somewhere. And money is going to come from two sources. Taxes, especially through, say, income taxes, which, if you remember, had just been implemented a few years before, as well as through the selling of what were called Liberty bonds, government bonds you could purchase, in which you're basically loaning money to the government for the war effort, and then you could redeem those bonds later with interest. So we're going to see that as the two primary sources for war funding. We're also going to see something called wartime socialism implemented. This is not socialism in a strict sense, but really it's a term used to describe the efforts made by the federal government to intervene in the economy and control some parts of the economy to a greater effort than ever before. For example, the Railroad Administration will be created, in which the federal government will run the railroads. The idea being that the railroads needed to run incredibly smoothly. We needed to ensure that rail traffic did not become snarled and tangled as we're trying to ship wartime goods to the Atlantic in order to be shipped across the Atlantic to France. what we're going to see is that the government will not own the railroads. The railroad companies will still enjoy a profit, but the day-to-day running of the railroads will be done by the federal government. The Food Administration will be created to ensure that food production is where it needed to be for the war effort, and also to ensure that we could raise enough food for the French and for the British war efforts as well. Now, what we're going to see is the federal government will not run the farms. The federal government will not take over agriculture in any meaningful way, but it will establish higher prices for a lot of major crops like wheat, corn, hogs, things like that, in an effort to encourage farmers to grow more. In addition to that, the Food Administration will encourage Americans to voluntarily ration their food. This is not mandatory like it would be in World War II, 20 years down the road. Very much voluntary, but the idea is to encourage Americans to do so from a patriotic motivation. Do your part to help out the war effort. Conserve food. Don't eat wheat on Wednesdays. Don't eat pork on Thursdays. Things like that. And the hopes is that by American consumers consuming less food, that would enable more food to be shipped over for the war effort. Last but not least, we're going to see the creation of the War Industries Board, in which the United States government will greatly encourage American industry to produce wartime goods. So all of these are major efforts at getting the economy to produce for the war. Federal efforts at economic intervention that had never really before been seen. In many ways, this is a progressive's dream. It's not that progressives are happy about war, but many progressives like Wilson see this war as an opportunity to really implement a progressive vision of government intervention in the economy. So needless to say, the government will greatly ramp up its efforts to mobilize the American people for war. Last but not least, I don't think we can get out of this without talking a little bit about the use of propaganda. As Wilson said, trying to mobilize a whole people for war, not just, say, an army. So how to persuade the American people to support the war? Through propaganda efforts. This could be through encouraging songwriters to write pro-war songs, encouraging Hollywood to produce pro-war films. Could be through, massive poster campaign in which you flood the country with posters encouraging Americans to do their part to support the war effort. Buy Liberty bonds. This you can see is aimed at this particular poster on the upper left, aimed at immigrants to the United States. Remember your first thrill of American liberty. Remember when you saw that Statue of Liberty. Now you can do your part for this country that has welcomed you. Help crush the menace of the seas. Buy Liberty bonds. Your purchase of Liberty bonds will help destroy those German U-boats in the Atlantic. You can knit socks. You can conserve food. All of these are ways that you can be at home in Texas or Kansas or Ohio, a long way, thousands of miles from the front, and still be able to contribute to the war effort. So clearly, this is a war that the federal government believes is necessary for the country, and a war which many believe that was necessary for the entire people to support, to get behind. Now, since this is such an incredible war effort, since it required ultimately sending millions of troops overseas, you could see what kind of impact this could have on the economy. You have to produce weapons for war, you have to produce the uniforms, you have to produce the ships to get everything across the Atlantic. This is a major industrial effort. Not as large as we would see in the Second World War, but definitely a sign of things to come. Now, what does this mean in the long run? Does this initiate long-term changes in the U.S. economy? That that wartime socialism, is that something that would remain even as the war faded into memory after 1918? That's not really going to be the case. After World War I, what we are going to see is that the United States demobilizes. The military is scaled back down to a much smaller size, to its pre-war levels. The economy will shift back to being a peacetime economy, producing things for American consumers, not for the military. A lot of those funding efforts are no longer needed, of course. You don't need to be selling Liberty bonds after the war. Income tax rates will be allowed to drop back down, as we'll talk about later on. The Railroad Administration is done away with, the War Industries Board, the Food Administration, all of those are dismantled after the war. So it's not necessarily going to create any long-term changes, but that doesn't mean it's not important. A lot of people remembered the shared effort, and a lot of people remembered the increase in government intervention during the war. And that is going to come back in a pretty big way in the 1930s during the Great Depression. As a matter of fact, when we talk about the Great Depression and the New Deal, we will see that a lot of the efforts aimed at combating the Great Depression will be in many ways based on the experience of World War I, in which the government intervened in the economy to get the economy ready for war. In the Great Depression, it will be government intervention in the economy to fight the Great Depression. So when we talk about the New Deal, we'll come back to World War I here and there and see some of those connections. Hopefully this little brief talk, brief as in 30 minutes brief apparently, gives you some idea of American involvement in the war, as well as kind of how the war influenced U.S. economic development at the time. See y'all on Thursday.